Marty's filmmaking career is now in its 6th decade, and in all that time, he's directed 25 narrative features and 16 feature documentaries. And of those 41 movies, maybe 6 or 7 could be called crime dramas. And yet, for better or for worse, many people who have only a passing knowledge of Scorsese's movies likely associate him with crime dramas and gangster fare. So if you're one of those people who dismiss The Irishman out of hand as just another Scorsese gangster movie, stop it. It's not so much that Scorsese only makes gangster movies, or even mostly makes gangster movies. It's more that the ones that he has made have pretty much defined the genre. I mean, any list of the best gangster movies ever made is going to be like half Scorsese. For that reason, chastising haters aside, I guess it's only appropriate that his opus about looking back on your life and everything you've ever done would take the shape of an expansive gangster crime epic. The 77-year-old director's latest begins in a nursing home with octogenarian Frank Sheeran, played by Robert De Niro, directly addressing the camera. In this confessional style, he recalls a fateful road trip he took a quarter century earlier from Philadelphia to Detroit with aged mob boss and longtime friend Russell Buffalino, played by Joe Pesci. Early in this road trip flashback, the movie flashes back a second time to Frank's time as a truck driver for a meatpacking company in his 30s, when he first meets Russell and becomes a lackey for the Buffalino crime family. The story moves forward from there, chronicling Frank's rise from Buffalino lackey to Buffalino hitman, while it occasionally returns to old Frank on the road trip and really old Frank addressing the camera in the nursing home. Eventually, the main storyline catches up to this fateful road trip, and it becomes clear why Frank's life story confessional begins with and occasionally returns to this road trip, as it ends up being the most consequential trip of his life. After Frank proves himself capable of painting houses, which is a blood splatter-related euphemism for performing hits, Russell introduces him to union leader Jimmy Hoffa, played by Al Pacino. And Frank transitions from being a crony for the In the Shadows crime boss to being a crony for the high-profile union leader. And this is how old Frank's narration introduces Jimmy Hoffa.
Nowadays, young people, they don't know who Jimmy Hoffa was. They don't have a clue. I mean, maybe they know that he disappeared or something, but that's about it. But back then, there wasn't nobody in this country who didn't know who Jimmy Hoffa was.
An astute and helpful observation, as this young person only knew that Hoffa disappeared, and that's about it. Turns out, as Frank's narration continues,
In the 50s, he was as big as Elvis. In the 60s, he was like the Beatles. And next to the president, he was like the most powerful man in the country. Bar none.
I had no idea before this movie, but Hoffa captured the respect and admiration of millions of Americans, including and especially Frank's daughter Peggy, played by Lucy Galena as a child and Anna Paquin as an adult. In these early years, young Peggy's admiration for Hoffa is in direct contrast with her disdain for Russell and her indifference towards Frank. She sees her father's violent ways firsthand, and she deduces the nature of his work for Russell.
Where are you going?
I'm going to work.
In the later years, Peggy's indifference towards her father turns to disdain, as she suspects that he was involved in Jimmy Hoffa's disappearance. Much has been written about Anna Paquin's lack of lines, but her silence is the whole point. She's silently judging Frank, and she's the audience stand-in by doing so. The whole point of old Frank in the nursing home telling his story directly to camera is that he's trying to explain himself, attempting to justify the choices that he made that ultimately made his daughter hate him.
I know I wasn't a good dad. I know that. I was just trying to protect all yous.
From what?
This framing device makes the movie a confessional. It's not a spoiler to say that it ends with Frank talking to a priest, and given the final shot of the movie, it stands to reason that whoever Frank is addressing as he looks directly at the camera is also intended to be a priest, or perhaps God himself, or herself. This comes out in the language of his narration, how he's embarrassed by parts of his own story. When he talks about when he left his first wife for his second wife, he's like ashamed of himself. Eventually, Frank comes to a crossroads where he must decide between Russell Buffalino and Jimmy Hoffa. And maybe it's not even much of a choice. One of the interesting through lines of the movie is its meditation on power. Young Peggy rebukes Russell and is taken by Jimmy because Russell's clearly a criminal and Jimmy at least appears to be clean. Jimmy doesn't get his hands dirty, so Peggy admires him because she assumes he isn't dirty. But his hands aren't dirty only because he makes Frank do his bidding. Frank is powerful in the sense that he can perform hits and beat the shit out of people, but the real power is not with Frank, but with whoever's holding the reins. And Jimmy Hoffa has the power to control not only Frank, but also billions of dollars of union money. One of several fascinating historical subplots involves how Hoffa's union money investments built Las Vegas to what it is today. In doing so, Hoffa commands the respect of Frank's daughter that eludes Frank his whole life. There's plenty of clear overlap with Goodfellas. Both are about one man's decades-long involvement in organized crime. And like Henry Hill in Goodfellas, Frank Sheeran is a passive character. In an early scene, Frank tells Russell about his time in Italy in World War II.
You got orders, you follow them. They tell you to bring some prisoners into the woods, and then they don't tell you what to do. But they just say, hurry up.
Russell Bufalino works the same way. He tells you to do something, and you take care of it however you take care of it.
And when you did something for Russ, you did it yourself. Like Russ used to say.
When I ask somebody to take care of something for me, I expect them to take care of it themselves. I don't need two roads coming back to me.
After Frank's time as a soldier in Italy, he's then a soldier for the Bufalino family. And then he's a soldier for Jimmy Hoffa. But he never has any power of his own, or any control over the events around him. He's a cog in a machine, powerless to prevent the death of his friend. Another clear overlap with Goodfellas is, obviously, the presence of Robert De Niro and Joe Pesci. And De Niro's giving the best performance he's given in like a decade. Understated, but still conflicted, and by the end, pained. And as impossible as it may seem, this is actually the first collaboration between Al Pacino and Scorsese. And, Pacino's kind of been in ostentatious shouty mode for the last 30 years.
Because she got a great ass!
But shouty mode works well when he's playing an ostentatious, overconfident union boss.
Locals! Damn it! How do you do that?
But the real revelation of the movie is Joe Pesci, emerging out of semi-retirement to deliver one final devastating performance for the director that made his career in the 80s and 90s. Do not expect the fiery, short-fused firecracker that he played in Goodfellas and Casino, or even in My Cousin Vinny and Home Alone. Here, Pesci never even raises his voice, and yet he's still as menacing and terrifying as Tommy DeVito in Goodfellas. In one key scene, Frank Sheeran finds himself explaining questionable actions to mob boss Angelo Bufalino in a brief appearance from Harvey Keitel. And Pesci's Russell Bufalino doesn't even have to say a word in the entire scene, and yet he's as captivating and tension-inducing with silent looks as he is in the Why Am I Funny scene. The digital de-aging of the characters was like the big hook talking point of this movie, and it ballooned the budget north of $150 million, hence why Netflix got involved. And I thought it worked fine for the most part. Like, the first cut from 55-year-old Frank's face to 35-year-old Frank's face is like a little jarring, but I got used to it. On the Directors Guild of America Director's Cut podcast, Scorsese said that he sees the digital de-aging as just the next evolution of film makeup. You have to factor in how it affects lighting and camera angles, but you have to do that with makeup too. Admittedly, the digital de-aging is, for now, limited to faces, and there's only so much that can be done to make a 75-year-old body look like a 35-year-old. It's what it is. So, why age down older actors? Why not cast younger actors for the younger scenes and then use traditional makeup to age them up for the older scenes, which is what would have been done in the first 100 years of movie making? And the answer is simple. That would change the movie down to its bones. The Irishman is about an old man looking back at his life, whether that old man is Frank Sheeran or Robert De Niro or Martin Scorsese. Take your pick. A younger man playing Frank Sheeran would lose this pathos. More important than the overlap with Goodfellas are the differences. Where Goodfellas is a frenetic, hyper-stylized roller coaster, Scorsese said at the time that he wanted the movie to feel like an amusement park ride. The Irishman is a patient slow burn, with a 200-minute runtime to prove it. The framing device of that opening road trip from Philadelphia to Detroit is a decent metaphor for the movie's leisurely sprawl. Frank and Russell could fly, but they opt to drive and take their time and take care of some business along the way and reminisce about when they were younger men. And they are certainly no longer younger men. Where Goodfellas followed Henry Hill from adolescence to middle age, The Irishman follows its characters from middle age to the grave. When secondary and tertiary characters are introduced, there's a freeze frame and text that displays their name and the date and manner of their death, underlining that this movie is, above all, about endings. As I mentioned, Scorsese is now 77 years old, De Niro is 76, Pesci is 76, Pacino is 79. Yeah, these guys might continue to make movies for another 10 years, Clint Eastwood's 89 after all, but it's hard to not consider this movie something of a swan song, especially given the nature of the story, chronicling the lives of these men from their 30s to their 80s. It all has the air of, we've been at this all our lives, and we've had a good run, but now it's over. Earlier this year, director Todd Phillips used the term Trojan horsing to describe his attempt to hide a psychological character drama inside a superhero movie. An argument could be made that Scorsese and screenwriter Steve Zaillian used a gangster movie Trojan horse to deliver a movie about getting old and outliving everyone you ever knew and having nothing but time on your hands to look back on your life as you sit around and wait for death. Far too many cultural critics over the years have made the mistake of equating the actions and morals of Scorsese's characters with Scorsese himself, and yet it's hard not to notice that the main character of The Irishman is taking stock of his life's work in a movie that plays like the greatest hits album of the director that made it, from the genre to the soundtrack to the locations to the players involved. I don't even know how to judge The Irishman against the rest of Scorsese's filmography. It just feels like it's so in conversation with his career, it's hard to place it among the other works in his career. But, regardless of whether or not this will live on as one of his best movies, it's, too soon to tell. It certainly feels like both a piece of a whole and also like a culmination of one of the greatest careers in filmmaking history.